There is something Mark Lowry said recently, not in a formal interview, but in the kind of candid conversation that circulates among fans who pay close attention, that stopped people in the gospel community cold. He said there were years, during the time he was away from Bill Gaither and the homecoming stage, when he could not tell the difference anymore between making people laugh and performing making people laugh. That is not a small thing for a man whose entire ministry, and it was a ministry, was built on the idea that the humor came from somewhere genuine, that it was real. For years, fans who watched those homecoming recordings assumed that the Mark Lowry on that stage was simply the Mark Lowry who existed off stage. They were only half right. What the 8 years away revealed about him, and what coming back to Bill Gaither in 2009 restored, is a story the gospel world has never told completely. Stay with us. Because what comes together around the 10-minute mark changes the way you watch every homecoming recording you have ever loved. Mark Lowry has been one of the most recognizable faces in Southern gospel for going on 40 years. He sang baritone with the Gaither Vocal Band across 2 separate tenures, 1988 to 2001, and again from 2009 through the end of 2013. Nearly 2 decades of homecoming tapings, arena concerts, and Sunday evenings in cities across America, standing just left of Bill Gaither, and doing something that nobody in that world has managed to replicate before or since. But if you have followed Mark from the beginning, you know his place in gospel music was secured before he ever made anyone laugh on a Gaither stage. He wrote "Mary, Did You Know?" And there is almost no one in America who attends Christmas services who has not heard that lyric in the last 30 years. He wrote it with Buddy Green, and it has since been recorded by more artists than anyone has properly counted. Kenny Rogers, Winona, Pentatonix, who put it back into the charts decades after Mark first put it on paper. The lyric, so carefully observed, so theologically weighted, outlasted every trend that tried to date it. That song alone would have secured Mark a permanent place in the story of American gospel music. But for the generation who discovered him through the homecoming recordings, millions of people who wore out those tapes and knew every face on that stage the way you know family, the song was almost beside the point. What they loved was him. The quick eyes, the timing, the way he could walk right up to the edge of a sacred moment and say the one thing that made the whole room exhale and feel human again. For everyone who spent Sunday evenings with those recordings, Mark was not just a singer. He was the man who made everything feel true, not produced, not assembled, true. He grew up in Houston, in a Baptist household where faith was taken seriously. He has spoken openly over the years about finding his voice early, in both senses of the phrase, and discovering that laughter inside a room full of believers was its own form of calling. By the late 1980s, Bill Gaither had watched Mark long enough to know exactly what he was bringing onto his stage when he made the call. He brought him in with his eyes open. What developed between them across the years that followed was not quite what it looked like from the outside. Here is something most people do not think about unless they have sat through a Gaither homecoming concert in person. Those events ran long, 3 hours, sometimes 4. The music was genuinely extraordinary. David Phelps could silence a room with a single phrase. Guy Penrod's voice filled spaces that felt too large for any human being, and the weight of the testimonies and arrangements built something sacred in the air over the course of an evening. People came to those concerts carrying real things, their grief, their health struggles, their years. They came wanting to feel something true, but there is a thing that happens in a room that holds too much weight for too long. Somewhere past the 90-minute mark, the emotional register can climb so high that people begin, without deciding to, protecting themselves from it. They go slightly numb. The tears they were ready to cry get held back because there has been too much already, and they are not sure they have more left to give. Bill Gaither understood this better than almost anyone working in gospel music. He had been doing this long enough to know that a room needs air, not a lesser song, not a break. Air. A genuine human moment that lets everyone in those seats exhale and find themselves again before the next wave of music comes. Mark Lowry was that moment, every night. But here is what made what Mark did different from anything a comedian or personality might have provided. He did not perform at the audience. He performed at Bill, directly. with a precision that only comes from knowing exactly what you are doing and why. He would let Bill build toward one of those carefully weighted song introductions, the kind where the room could feel something serious arriving, and then, at almost exactly the right moment, deliver something aimed straight at the gap between what Bill was presenting and what everyone in that room privately understood. The gap between the legend and the man. Longtime Homecoming fans will remember the type of moment, even if they could not name which recording it came from. Bill mid-sentence, room leaning in, and then Mark, quietly, with timing that felt almost surgical, saying the one thing that broke the whole place open. Not a performance laugh, the real kind. And Bill stopping, looking at Mark, and then laughing himself. The full-face laugh. Not accommodation, the real kind from him too. The cameras kept rolling. Then there was the evening, documented across more than one concert recording from the first tenure, when Mark stopped a taping to inform Bill, in front of a full Homecoming audience, that the tempo was wrong. Not suggested it, told him, plainly, as if they were the only two people in the building. Bill looked at him. The room went still. Bill adjusted the tempo. Mark said thank you, and they moved forward. That is not a man who cannot help himself. That is a man executing a specific assignment with complete confidence, because the man who gave him the assignment was right there on the same stage, watching, and had never once asked him to stop. Which raises the question nobody asked for years. Why would Bill Gaither, who built the most successful gospel music enterprise in American history, design a stage where his own baritone teased him in front of thousands of people, night after night, across more than a decade? The answer is not what most people assumed, and neither is what happened when Mark walked away in 2001, and what those 8 years did to him. Stay with us, because the story of that time away is what changes everything about how you understand the man you watched on those recordings. And this is where the story becomes something different from what it looked like on the surface. Mark has talked, in interviews and in public conversations that his fans have followed closely, about what happened to him in the years between 2001 and 2009, not the career, something harder to name than that. He has spoken about the distance that can grow between a man who spends his adult life helping other people feel spiritually alive inside a room, and what that same man comes home to when the room empties. He has been honest about loneliness, in a way that most performers in his position never permit themselves to be. He has talked about being a single man, traveling, performing, filling arenas, and the particular silence that follows all of it. But what he has said more recently, and this is the part that reframes everything, is that during those years away, something happened to the humor itself. He stopped being able to tell whether it was real. For a man whose entire ministry rested on the premise that the laugh came from somewhere genuine, that it was not a routine but a reflex, not a performance but a response, that uncertainty was not a minor thing. It was the central thing, because if the humor had become performance, the question of what lay underneath it became unavoidable, and that question does not sit quietly once it arrives. Anyone who has walked through a long stretch of spiritual dryness will recognize what he is describing immediately, the motions continuing, the work going forward, the stage, the crowd, the laughter in all the right places, and underneath it, something gone quiet. Bill Gaither had not lost track of Mark during those years. He stayed in his life, and when he began talking to Mark about coming back in 2009, he was not unaware of what the time away had held. He asked Mark whether he still had it, not the voice. Bill had heard Mark sing plenty in those 8 years. He was asking about the other thing, the thing that could not be rehearsed or recovered by simply returning to the stage. Mark has described his answer as something close to, "I think so. I need to find out." That is a different return than the one most coverage of the second tenure suggests. Most of the gospel world treated it as a reunion, a welcome postscript. What it actually was, for Mark, was closer to a question being put to the test. Whether the thing that had always felt natural, standing in front of people who came seeking something sacred and making them human enough to receive it, was still genuinely there, or whether the years had taken something that would not come back. He got his answer the first night of the first Homecoming taping of the second tenure. He has described the moment without naming the specific song or the exact words, but with complete clarity about what it meant. Bill was doing what Bill always did, building the room, establishing the weight of what was coming. And Mark felt something he had not felt in years. Not a decision to be funny. Not a reading of the room and a calculation, something older than both of those, a reflex. And he followed it. He said something. The room broke, and Bill laughed, with the full face, the real thing, the laugh that had always been there, when what Mark did was working, and not simply acceptable. Mark has said that standing on that stage in 2009, in that moment, he understood two things at once: that it was still there, and that he understood for the first time, with a clarity he had not carried during the first tenure, exactly why it had always been there. He came back knowing something he had only suspected before, that the humor was not his personality leaking into ministry. It was the ministry. As deliberate as any lyric, as purposeful as any testimony. The teasing was not Mark being unable to help himself in front of Bill Gaither. It was Mark doing precisely what Bill needed done, puncturing just enough reverence to keep the room honest, to keep the people in those seats connected to themselves, so that when David Phelps walked to the microphone, or when Guy Penrod's voice filled the room, it landed somewhere real and not somewhere guarded. Watch the second tenure recordings alongside the originals and something becomes visible. The timing is as sharp, the humor lands just as hard, but there is something underneath the later recordings that was not as visible in the earlier ones. When a moment needs silence, Mark gives it completely. He does not reach for the laugh when the room has moved past needing one. He does not soften what does not need softening. The man who came back in 2009 knew the difference in a way that can only come from having spent time without the thing and then having it returned. Wes Hampton, who had been with the group during the years Mark was away, spoke about what the stage felt like when Mark came back. He used the word presence, and he was clear about what he meant by it. Not charisma, not personality. Something about how the room worked. Things landed differently when Mark was there. David Phelps has described it in similar terms. The way Mark's humor functioned as preparation for what came after. A room that had just laughed from somewhere real was a room that could weep from somewhere real. The two were not opposites. They were the same door, opened from different directions. David could walk to a microphone after a Mark Lowry moment and deliver something like, "End of the beginning," and the room was already open. Mark had already done what needed doing. Bill Gaither, who spent 6 decades understanding how faith moves through a gathered room, chose to have Mark on that stage for nearly 2 decades across 2 separate eras. Not because Mark was funny, because Bill understood, from the beginning, and confirmed by everything the second tenure demonstrated, what the funny was for. For those of us who have followed Mark across all of those years, through every homecoming recording, every Christmas special, all of it, this is not, when you sit with it, entirely surprising. You felt it without being able to name it. Think about a night in your own life, a church service, maybe years ago. A revival meeting, a gathering where someone said something that made the whole room laugh. Not inappropriately, not disrespectfully, but at exactly the right moment. When the evening had grown so heavy that everyone was holding themselves slightly apart from it. And then the laugh came. And your shoulders dropped. And 10 minutes later, when the music rose or the prayer was spoken, you were somewhere real instead of somewhere guarded. You did not plan to be moved that night. You were moved because someone let the air back in first. That was Mark Lowry's assignment. For thousands of people who walked into those arenas carrying things they had not put down in years, grief, illness, the particular weight of getting older in a world that does not always make space for faith, he made them put it down for 30 seconds, and they could not pick it back up the same way when the music came. The gospel community has honored the voices of the homecoming era completely, and those voices deserve every word of that honor. But the conversation about what held all of it together, what made those long evenings work across 30 years of productions, that conversation has not yet fully arrived at what Mark Lowry actually was in those rooms. If you have been a fan since those early homecoming recordings, you know what the stage felt like when he was there. You probably know, just as clearly, what it felt like when he was not. There is one more part of this story that most people have not connected yet, and it goes back to 1994. When Michael English left the Gaither Vocal Band that year, and the reasons became public, it left a wound in that group that was visible even through the professionalism with which everyone handled it. English had a voice capable of things that very few singers in any genre can do. His departure was painful for everyone involved, for Bill, for the group, and for the audiences who had grown to love what he brought. What shifted quietly in the years that followed is rarely discussed. Mark's role changed, not in the program, not on paper, in the room. The group in the mid-90s was carrying a visible loss, and the audiences at those tapings and concerts could sense it, even when they could not name it. What that room needed in those years, particularly those first years after 1994, was what Mark had always provided. Only the need was deeper. Because the room was grieving something real, and grief, left tending to itself in a sacred space, can collapse inward. Mark has spoken carefully about understanding loss from the inside, about knowing that a person can be gifted and broken at the same time, and that neither fact cancels the other. He was honest about his own version of that tension long before it became common for performers in gospel music to speak that way, and what he brought to those mid-90s homecoming stages, underneath the humor, underneath the timing, was the presence of someone who had looked at that tension honestly and kept showing up anyway. Bill Gaither has said across many years that the homecoming world was always built on honesty about what people actually carry. The songs do not pretend that struggle is not real. The testimonies do not clean up the hard places. And Mark, at his best across both tenures, was the most honest person on that stage, because the humor was always pointing at the gap between what people present and what they actually are. And in pointing at that gap, night after night, without ever stating it directly, he made clear that grace lives right there, in the gap. That is where it has always been found. That line runs from 1988 all the way through 2013, from the first time he made Bill Gaither laugh on camera in front of a full arena to the last homecoming taping of his second tenure. The humor was always pointing somewhere. The people in those rooms felt it, even when they could not have told you what exactly they were feeling. What comes next for Mark Lowry, at 68, still performing, still talking about faith with that particular combination of weight and laughter that has defined him across 4 decades, is something his longtime fans are watching with genuine attention. He has not closed a door. He and Bill Gaither share something that does not reduce to a working relationship or even a straightforward friendship. 40 years of a particular understanding, a trust that survived departures and returns, and the kind of honesty that only develops between two people who have known each other across the full length of an adult life. Whether that produces another chapter together, nobody outside those conversations can say. What Mark has left open, and it feels deliberate, is the question of what his ministry looks like in this next stretch. The humor is still there. The understanding of why it matters has never been more plainly stated than it is now, at this point in his life, when he is talking about it with the clarity of someone who lost it for a season and had it returned. For the fans who have followed him since those first homecoming recordings, who watched him tease Bill Gaither in front of thousands, and then watched the whole room weep at the next song, one thing holds. Mark Lowry's story is not finished. And neither, it turns out, is his explanation of why the teasing was always the most serious thing on that stage. If this story stayed with you, the next video on this channel will as well. We have been covering another voice from the Gaither Vocal Band, whose departure left questions the gospel community never fully answered in public. And what came out of that situation is just as unexpected as anything you heard today.